Welcome to this episode of the Continue Change podcast. How are
Thanks
you
for having
doing
me.
today?
I'm doing well. It's a beautiful day. It feels like fall is coming, so can't complain.
Yes, it does feel like fall is coming. And where are you where it's turning to fall already? What town do you live in and what do you do?
I live in Grand Rapids. I work in Holland, Michigan, and I
Mm-hmm.
work as the Advancement and Communications Director at Good Samaritan Ministries in Holland. And the mission of Good Sam is to end poverty and homelessness. So we're working directly with those that are living on the margins, struggling the most in Ottawa County. And I have the privilege of telling the stories of my colleagues and of the people we work with.
Wow. So you're working to end poverty during a time when things are arguably getting tougher for a lot of Americans. But you've been doing this for a very long time, and that space is always a little bit crazy. What did your challenges look like a year ago, and what do they look like today when it comes to marketing and communications?
Yeah, so a year ago, affordable housing is a huge issue all over the country, and we see that in West Michigan as well. And so, um, working on obviously working with our team to try to meet the demands that come along with the needs for affordable housing, trying to move people out of homelessness when it's almost impossible to find housing for anybody, even if you have
Yeah,
money, it's hard, right?
yeah.
And so trying to, from a communication standpoint, explain that dynamic. What does it look like for a family who is working full time, they're working hard, and they're still not able to afford a home in the community in which they work. And so
Hmm,
it's a hard concept to grasp. I think there's
hmm.
some generational gaps there, and it's just if you've not experienced that world, it's hard to dig into it and to empathize with it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was
Mm-hmm.
something that we've always had a challenge with in talking with our community about poverty in general.
Hmm. Do
Not to
you
mention
feel
it's a
like,
poverty most people want to avoid. So
yeah. Do you feel like there is almost a lack of education and that a lot of your marketing and communications efforts are trying to educate people on the problem?
yeah, I think in the details of the problem, right? I think everyone
Mhm.
knows that poverty and homelessness exists someplace, but it's
Right.
hard to,
Somewhere. Over
right.
there, probably, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. In some big city that I'm not attached to. But
Yeah.
when you're talking about people in your own community, maybe people that work with you, they sit next to you at church, their kids sit next to your kids at school, suddenly that close to home conversation becomes harder to take. And
Mm.
you get that, the NIMBY vibe, right? It's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's one doesn't exist in my backyard. And I don't
Yes.
really know how I feel about doing what needs to be done in my own community to change that. And so
Hmm.
it's educating more on the realities of the problem in our own community.
Hmm. So in many ways, you're kind of creating a local social movement. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. I think along with a lot of other partners in the community who have
Mm-hmm.
worked hard to expose what the issues are. A few years ago, United Way had a big campaign around ALICE, if you're familiar with that. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
ALICE is a term, it's asset limited, income constrained, and
Mm-hmm.
employed. And it was a shift from the working poor term. And it's more of a humanizing term to describe
Mm-hmm.
people in that situation. And so I think with that movement, a lot of the partners were able to wrap around and say, hey, these are the people. Alice is in your community.
Hmm.
And this is what Alice looks like. And so it's been a
Hmm.
conversation we've been having as a community for a while.
Hmm. Do you think the internet is making that easier or harder?
Mm.
Depends on the
Oh,
day.
yeah, I think so, right? And it depends what you're looking at.
Yeah.
If opinion digs into it, everybody has their own perceptions on why people are in the financial situation they're in. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and I think
Mm-hmm.
they feel that about themselves and they see that in others too. And so, fortunately, I think having online tools, so
Mm-hmm.
from these different partners, having those tools and easily being able to share those tools. So as a fundraiser, when I'm communicating with donors, we can have a conversation, but then it's very easy to dig in and find some data that I can send their way and they can read on their own time or pass along. So those kinds of resources have certainly made the conversation easier.
Right. You can prove the results of your model more
Mm-hmm.
effectively online than you used to be able to.
Right. And it's not just a feel good, we're doing this because we want to help people, but it's a, hey, listen, these are the numbers, this is the data. Not only are
Mm-hmm.
people struggling, but our community struggles because
Mm-hmm.
of these issues. And there's easily shareable information that
Mm-hmm.
backs that up.
And fund givers, or donors as they're normally called, are getting savvier, would you say, and expecting that data more often than not?
I think so. And part of that is the accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
You go 50 years ago and people were maybe aware of a nonprofit in very close to home, or something their church was doing or something their school was doing. But now you can access everything. And I think people
Yeah.
are willing to dig into information about what works, what doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
and get information on that, because they know it's there, and they know that if they want to
Mm-hmm.
give responsibly, knowing
Right.
where they get their biggest bang for their buck is important.
Right. We're now all competing as a nonprofit on a global stage, and people can shop for which nonprofit they think is going to have the biggest impact.
Right.
Hmm.
Yep.
Hmm.
Not a
So,
bad thing.
not a bad thing, right? Competition can be a good thing.
Yeah,
Transparency is almost always a good thing in my experience.
definitely.
So you were sitting there a year ago. What were you hoping to tackle in this past year, and did COVID have any impact on that? Did you have a big goal that got accelerated?
We did. So I would say a year ago, we were starting to explore how do we be more proactive in our work. So Good
Mm,
Sam gets a lot of public funding. About half of our dollars come from public dollars. And as I'm sure you know, public dollars have a lot of strings attached to them.
mm-hmm,
And you're fairly limited on how you can use those dollars. And so while we're grateful for the funding that we have, and we certainly are able to spend it, we're limited on how much proactive work we can do. So a year
mm-hmm,
ago, and even 6 months ago, we were dreaming about how do we work more in homelessness prevention? How do we find funding to keep people from losing their housing in the first place?
mm-hmm,
Because we know that if we can keep someone in their housing, they then don't have an eviction on their record. They get to just stay in their housing, which is saving on a lot of trauma, and
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
especially if there are children involved. That's obviously something you want to avoid. And it costs less money to keep someone in their house than to have them enter into homelessness and start the whole process over again. It's expensive to move, and we all
Yeah,
know that, right?
yeah. So regardless of where you stand on various issues, there's a simple ROI attached to stopping homelessness from happening.
Absolutely. There's a head and heart component, and there's
Hmm,
a business component too. It makes sense, and it's faster too to keep someone
hmm,
in their housing. So we were thinking through how do we fund this, because we would need you'd still need dollars to do it. COVID threw us into that pool very quickly.
hmm,
So I think we know that a lot of people lost their jobs in a really short amount of time. And so all of these people that we knew were right on the edge, so that Alice
mm-hmm,
population,
mm-hmm,
many of them went over the edge when COVID hit. And it took
hmm.
a while for some of those unemployment checks to come through, for the stimulus checks to come through. So in the meantime, people were draining their savings accounts and falling behind on rent.
Yeah.
So
You had a
when the
whole section of people that fell into poverty that weren't technically in poverty before.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, didn't qualify for any sort of services. And certainly at Good Sam, and I know talking to other agencies, we've seen so many people who've never been in the social service sector
Hmm,
requesting assistance that suddenly entered in. I mean, it's just massive numbers.
hmm,
When COVID started, they did put a moratorium on evictions for a while because they knew it was going to
hmm,
be an issue. But that
hmm,
moratorium lifted on July 15. And
hmm,
so leading up to that, we were notified by the state that we would be handed down a program for an eviction diversion program, to try to keep all of these people who would suddenly enter into the court systems from losing their housing. So this thing we dreamed about, that we were, sort of starting to get our thoughts around, was dropped in our lap, and they said, you have to hire a team of people and spend down over $700,000 by the end of 2020.
So it went from kind of talking about skydiving to free falling in the sky all at once. What was that like for your team?
Oh, I think it's the only time as a fundraiser that I looked at the dollar amount that had come through, because we knew something was coming, but we didn't think it would be that big. It's the only time I've looked at a number and said, that's too much. Like, what are we going to do with that? Because that amount of capacity building in the short amount of time, because when they notified us, it was sort of this needs to be done yesterday. Like, this should already be up and running. I think it was the end of June that we were notified, and evictions lifted July 15. So it was a shock at first, and then we all gathered ourselves and calmed each other down at different points.
Dusted the dust off your shoulders a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. And ultimately, we knew we were prepared to do it. We'd been thinking about it. So we had a structure, and when I say we, I mean my housing team that I work with. Yeah. And they dove in, and we hired 6 people in about a month and a half.
Wow. And during that phase of hiring, how did you reach out to potential candidates? Did you use digital or marketing initiatives to help with that? Or was it hiring from existing connections?
It was a mix of both. So we certainly, social was great, with so many people losing their jobs right now. Tons of people were sharing posts. So between LinkedIn and Facebook in particular, which a big audience that we have is on Facebook, they were sharing like crazy. And we had applications flying in. I don't think we've ever had that many applicants all at once. And I think it's just the market, but the word spread quickly that, hey, Good Sam's hiring. So
Yep. You might have had a really good ad, but it also is likely the fact that everyone needed a job.
Yeah, right. And I think there was also in terms of selling the position, it was, hey, this is boots on the ground. There's a lot going on in the world right now. We all feel pretty helpless. This is a place that you can step in and make a difference. And that's, I think, how we got the team on board that we did as quickly as we did, because they wanted to do that work.
So you have this giant amount of money to scale up a model that you've dreamed of, and you're doing it during a time when it's more necessary, literally, than ever before, right? There are so many people getting evicted right now. I don't know the numbers. Do you, by chance?
I can speak for a lot. So I can speak for our organization. So in a typical year, we did previously have some funding to serve people who are at risk of becoming homeless. In a typical year, we serve 20 families with homelessness prevention services. So people who'd received eviction notice. So that's 20 in a year. The first day that the eviction moratorium lifted, we got 50 calls from families, 10 calls from landlords. And the last numbers I heard was that we had 60 families that have been processed through the courts already since end of July, because that's really when the courts got running. And there's another 120-ish families that have their applications in and are just waiting for next steps. So that's compared to the 20 in a year. So it's
massive. It's massive.
And that's Ottawa County, right?
Yeah.
Which is in a different place from some other counties in Michigan, closer to Detroit or other places in the country. So it's, the need is great.
Yeah. For our listeners who aren't familiar, Ottawa County is not a giant county in population size in comparison to other counties. So you can imagine that scale is only, tenfold in other areas. So how are you communicating to the people that you're trying to serve? It feels like it would be difficult to find them.
So Good Sam's always been the central intake and referral for anyone in housing crisis for the county, and we're designated by the state to do that work. And so if people are contacting DHHS or 211, United Way, whatever venue they're going through, they're always getting filtered back to Good Sam for that intake process anyway. So I think we've, prior to all of this, there was a good funneling system already in place. But with this massive growing in demand, we tried to get the word out as best we could through local media. So talking with local news stations, so TV, radio, and the newspaper, and then on social, trying to share very easily shareable things saying, do you need help? Call Good Sam. It feels like that the lawyer's 1-800 commercial, but it's, along those lines.
But it works. And I think I'm hearing you say a little bit, Anne, that you guys had built up, you have such a strong history and you have a strong brand presence. So you are already the known go-to solution for this problem. So collecting names of the people that you're trying to serve is probably not one of your biggest challenges right now.
Correct. And people are desperate, so they're digging in pretty quickly into who can help me and who can help me most quickly. And the nice thing is we have great relationship with other community partners, other agencies. So if people are going to a local agency for food or for clothing or whatever needs they might need filled outside of housing, we've worked out some good communications between amongst ourselves to say, hey, if you're struggling with housing, this is where you go, and vice versa. If you need food, this is where you go from the Good Sam side. So that network existed before, and so we were pretty quickly able to adjust and make sure people are ending up where they need to end up in terms of service.
So what are the biggest challenges as a fundraiser right now for you? Is it figuring out how to manage this team? Is it figuring out how to fit this in with everything else that you need to do in the next 4 months? What would it be?
Yeah, the unknowns are, that's a hard part, and that's a hard part for everyone. We've had some very generous people step up in the beginnings of all of this. We've seen people, they realize there's a great need, they want to help. And so they've stepped in a number of ways, and financially is one of those ways. But 6 months from now, I don't think that January 1, 2021 is going to hit and all of this is going to go away. And so thinking through, what does this look like in 6 months when we know there are more people that need assistance? How are we going to help them at the level that we're helping them at now? So the team that we've hired they're all contract, because this grant we received has to be spent down by the end of the calendar year. And we would love to keep them around because we know that this is a program that works. We know this is something we want to continue doing, but funding it might be a different story. And what's coming down from the government is changing all the time. I just heard that there's potentially another eviction moratorium nationally that's going to go in. That might change things up. Yeah, so we'll see what happens there. But the unknowns are a challenge, and then also just not being able to do our typical fundraising events or just the normal cycle has been disrupted. All of the normal things that nonprofits can do right now are not working the way that they normally would. Right. And corporate funding, we're trying to be considerate and cautious in approaching corporate donors, knowing that some of them are struggling and have had to lay people off. And so balancing that, and also knowing that some of those are big funders for us. And usually year end is when they are supporting us. So wanting to keep our relationships going, regardless of whether they're able to support us financially anymore. But then figuring out how do we make up for some of these lost dollars that will likely come about.
And do I hear you saying that part of the challenge of scaling up is that you've scaled up, and now it'd be great to stay scaled up because you're serving a really big need.
Yes, it would be wonderful to be able to continue on the trajectory we're on. You know, as we said earlier, this is something we've talked about for a long time, and our mission is to end poverty and homelessness. And so if we're able to do all prevention work and keep people from entering homelessness in the first place, that's a huge step, right, for our work. That's
That would be a
what we
big
want
win.
to accomplish. Yeah, totally. And more than willing to work ourselves out of a job. But yeah, just the idea of being able to maintain, even from a spatial perspective, we've had to alter our office to accommodate 6 more people very quickly. And so thinking through long term, how do we not just keep them on, but how do we support everybody, and support them with salaries, but support them just with their daily working environment needs. All of those are considerations as well.
Culture, technology, all the things that make a employee a member of the team that is also a happy member of the team.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Well, what do you feel like you will do if the government money, quote unquote, runs out? Is your plan, and I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, Ann, but I think we see this in the nonprofit space sometimes where a really good idea is born and then it's funded, and then there's the ongoing funding, and that part can be the trickiest part. As you know, you've got something that needs ongoing funding here. How are you going to get it?
Yeah, I think the beauty is that we've been able to show that this is a model that works, and we're not counting on the government necessarily to shift all of their funding from rapid rehousing, which is the program that moves people out of homelessness, into prevention. That's not going to happen overnight. And, you know, the government tends to be slow on the pickup on that stuff anyway. So
speed of government, right? The speed of government is not fast.
It is not. So that we're not counting on that. But I do believe that there are some private funders who have seen this working, and I'm hoping will be willing to look at more of a long-term funding plan to keep it going. Also hoping that the need starts to slow down. Again, we don't know when all of this is going to clear up, but I don't think that a year from now we're going to have the kind of demand that we have right now. And so
we hope not.
I hope not.
Yeah.
I'm kind of done making predictions at this point, but
me too.
Yeah.
2020 has undone all of our predictions, right?
Seriously, it's I don't even know. But if we can keep it going and be able to serve what the typical demand would have been prior to COVID, or even if it's a little bit higher, you know, right now it's really kind of just running because of the high demand, but it would be an easier program to operate in the long term once things start to level out a bit. So I think if we can get over this hump for the time being and serve the people that need it, then in the long term, we can keep it more steady, you know, and serve people best. And that's ultimately our goal.
Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully you do manage to work yourself out of a job, but I don't imagine it's going to happen overnight.
No.
And the work that you are doing is so essential. And I have to pick a different word now, don't I? Not essential. It's so critical, mission critical.
There we go.
I am so grateful for that work, and I know that so many others are as well. What can we do to get involved? Give us a shameless plug. You've got a need and you've got an audience. What can you get us to do?
I think the first thing is that education piece. It's understanding the deeper issues at play. Again, we all come in with our own perspectives, our own ideas of who's in need and why they're in need. And if we can bridge those gaps between us and them, we tend to make those distinctions far too often. And if we can find ways to just get to know somebody different from ourselves and someone who's lived this experience, it opens our eyes to what these needs are, and honestly, how close we all are to to being in need ourselves. Many of us are a lot closer to poverty or homelessness than we care to think
realize. About. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so for me, that understanding is the first step. And that is what gets people to become supporters and advocates as well. If we can begin to bridge those gaps, and I think that's happening during COVID, we're all going through this major crisis together. And so it feels a lot less outside of all the political divisiveness happening. Going through the shared experience has made us feel in some ways more connected to each other, oddly, I think. And so carrying that forward and saying, okay, we're in this together. How are we going to serve each other? How are we going to help each other?
Yeah.
And then beyond that,
I think I heard a few amens out there somewhere. Definitely amen to that.
But beyond that, it's really figuring out what in your own community is the greatest need. Volunteering is challenging during COVID, especially, but there are opportunities to work with local agencies, whether that's around food. At Good Sam, it's right now helping with paperwork. And we're currently recruiting volunteers to actually be at the courts just to try to do some relationship, not building so much, but just relational connection. So people who are panicking about losing their housing have someone to talk to while they're waiting in line to get their paperwork done and to see legal services. So we have places where people can plug in for volunteer opportunities as well.
Wow. So you could volunteer just to help with paperwork and conversations. And that's very meaningful and necessary. But you can also give money, right?
Of course.
Money is always good.
Money is great. And part of that right now is talking through how do we keep this prevention service going, and also filling the gaps that currently exist in the prevention services. So public funding tends to not always cover all of the bases, and there are people who maybe are just on the brink of qualifying and don't quite qualify. And so receiving private dollars that can fill those gaps and then help us look beyond, so we don't feel like, all right, December 31st, we're done and we're just going to go back to normal. If we have some funding that we know we can carry forward, then we can plan and we can serve people best. And so that's one of the biggest places. And obviously, I mean, unrestricted gifts are great. We have lots of operations that, we're still doing everything else we were doing prior to COVID.
Yeah, this hasn't erased what your day-to-day work was. You're still doing all that.
Not at all. We are. It's different. But we still have case managers meeting remotely with folks. We have people doing long-term financial planning and goal setting with our program participants. We've got an office full of people who are working overtime, who also need to be supported. So it would, if I have an open audience, unrestricted gifts are always great.
Gifts. Amen. Yeah. Amen. Woo. Well, Anne, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and for talking to us a little bit about what it's been like to scale up a model during a stormy time. I hope that our listeners take action on this important issue that is only going to get more difficult in the next couple of months, and we're thankful that you're addressing it. So thanks for making space to get together today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of Continue Change.